Hi, I'm Rosie. I'm 30 and work as a manager at a local company. My husband Jake and I live in a small, comfortable house. Nothing extravagant, but it's ours, and we love it. I've always considered myself pretty down to earth and patient, qualities I've always valued in myself. For the most part, Jake and I have a really wonderful relationship. He's incredibly supportive and kind, and our marriage has been pretty happy for the past few years. There's just one thing, one rather significant thing, that casts a bit of a shadow. Jake's parents, Robert and Susan. I truly do believe family is important, but my in-laws are challenging, to say the least. They're incredibly blunt, the kind of people who say exactly what's on their minds, seemingly without a filter or any consideration for how their words might land. It can be incredibly difficult to navigate conversations with them, and honestly, I often find myself feeling tense and on edge when they're around. I'm learning to manage these interactions, but it's definitely a work in progress. I'm trying to find a balance between being respectful of their opinions and protecting my own sense of peace and well-being. It's a delicate dance, and I haven't quite mastered the steps yet. Sometimes I wonder if I'm being too sensitive, but then I replay their words in my head and, well, let's just say I'm still learning how to handle it all with grace and without letting it affect me too deeply. I want a good relationship with them, but I also need to set healthy boundaries. It's a constant process of figuring things out as I go. I feel like my privacy is constantly being invaded. It began innocently enough. Robert and Susan, my in-laws, would pop over for the occasional impromptu meal. At first, I didn't mind. They're family, after all. But these casual visits quickly escalated into a near-daily occurrence. They'd show up whenever the mood struck them, and since they have a key, they just let themselves in, regardless of whether we were expecting them or not. It started to feel less like a friendly visit and more like an intrusion. One morning, I was in the bathroom, getting ready for work, when I heard noises coming from the kitchen. Peeking out, I saw Susan bustling about. "Morning, Rosie. Thought I'd surprise you with breakfast," she chirped. I plastered a smile on my face, but inwardly I cringed. It felt so invasive, like my personal space was being disregarded. This wasn't a surprise, it was an overstep. The constant unexpected visits were starting to weigh on me. I cherish my quiet mornings, and having someone just barge in, even with good intentions, felt unsettling. I started to feel like I couldn't relax in my own home. I appreciate their desire to be close and involved in our lives, but I crave a sense of normalcy, a sense of having my own space and time. I need to feel like my home is my sanctuary, a place where I can unwind and be myself without the constant expectation of company. It's become increasingly difficult to maintain any semblance of privacy. I long for the simple comfort of knowing that when I'm home, I can truly be alone if I choose to be. I haven't quite figured out how to address this with them yet, but I know I need to find a way to reclaim my personal space without causing too much friction. It's a delicate balance, and I'm still trying to navigate it. It just didn't go the way I'd hoped. Susan immediately started crying, and Robert's face turned a shade of crimson. "Are you saying you don't want us in your life?" Susan sobbed. Then she added, "After everything we've done for you." I could see the shock on Jake's face. He stammered, "No, that's not what I meant at all." And that was it. The conversation just shut down. They were so good at making themselves seem like the injured party. Jake didn't have a chance. I felt so helpless watching him struggle, caught between his parents and us. Things only got worse after that. It wasn't just the constant dinners anymore. They began staying over, just for a night at first, using the guest room. Then, almost without my noticing how it happened, they were spending days on end at our place. It felt like we'd suddenly acquired permanent house guests, and the weight of their presence started to suffocate me. I knew I had to talk to Jake again, but the thought filled me with dread. I wasn't sure how much more of this I could take. It was beginning to feel like my own home wasn't mine anymore. The constant tiptoeing around his parents, the forced smiles, the endless stream of unsolicited advice. It was all wearing me down. I loved Jake, but this situation was starting to feel unbearable. I needed us to find a solution, and fast. I adore Jake, I really do. But his parents, well, let's just say they're a bit too present in our lives. I remember telling him, as gently as I could, "Honey, I love your parents, but this constant presence is becoming overwhelming." He sighed, the familiar gesture of running a hand through his hair already starting to wear on me. He promised to talk to them, and I desperately wanted to believe him. But a nagging feeling deep down told me it was pointless. They had this uncanny ability to make him feel guilty, and he just crumbled under the pressure. I felt trapped, caught between my love for him and the suffocating presence of his parents. It was an incredibly difficult situation, and I didn't know how to navigate it. Living with Jake's parents popping in unannounced felt like being stuck in a recurring nightmare, the same scene playing out over and over. A quick breakfast visit would morph into lunch, then linger into dinner. Our guest rooms started to feel more like their annex, their personal space within our home. I genuinely tried to be understanding. I really did. I told myself they were just being loving parents, showing their support for their son. But with each passing day, their constant presence chipped away at my patience and my sense of privacy. It became harder and harder to maintain a smile and pretend everything was okay. One Saturday morning, the familiar clang of pots and pans jolted me awake. It wasn't the gentle sound of us preparing a leisurely weekend breakfast. No, it was the unmistakable symphony of his parents, already bustling around my kitchen, making themselves at home. Again. And that familiar wave of frustration washed over me, leaving me feeling increasingly resentful and trapped in my own home. I knew something had to change, but I was terrified of what confronting the situation might do to my relationship with Jake. I rubbed the sleep from my eyes and glanced at the clock. 6:30 a.m. Already? A wave of exhaustion washed over me as I shuffled into the kitchen. The bright, overly cheerful scene that greeted me was jarring. Susan was bustling around, humming to herself, a stack of pancakes growing on the plate beside the stove. "Good morning, Rosie. I thought we'd have a big family breakfast," she chirped, seemingly oblivious to my stunned silence. I forced a smile and mumbled a polite, "Good morning, Susan." "That's nice of you." The smell of the pancakes was sweet and slightly nauseating. I sank into a chair at the table, cradling a mug of coffee, trying to process this unexpected burst of domesticity. I watched Susan move around my kitchen, so at ease, so proprietary. It felt strange, unsettling. Robert strolled in a few minutes later, newspaper tucked under his arm. "Morning, Rosie. Sleep well?" he asked, absent-mindedly, his attention already absorbed by the sports pages. I just nodded, still feeling disoriented. The coffee was slowly starting to work its magic, but the fog in my brain hadn't fully lifted. Then Jake appeared, blinking sleepily, his expression mirroring my own bewilderment at this unusually boisterous morning. I could almost feel a silent, shared "what's going on" passing between us. The whole situation felt surreal, like I'd stumbled into someone else's life. I took a long sip of my coffee, bracing myself for whatever the morning might bring. "Mom! Dad! What are you two doing here so bright and early?" I heard Jake mumble, sleepily rubbing his eyes. I hadn't even registered they were there yet. "We thought we'd surprise you with breakfast, sweetie," Susan chirped, flipping a pancake with a theatrical flourish. I caught Jake's eye and he shot me an apologetic glance. I just shrugged, a weary feeling settling in my stomach. I had a feeling this was going to be more than just breakfast. And I was right. After that morning, their visits became increasingly frequent. It started subtly, with a toothbrush here, a robe there. Then, gradually, more and more of their belongings started appearing in the guest room. It wasn't long before it felt less like a guest room and more like their second bedroom. Pictures of them, knickknacks, even special pillows started to appear. It began to feel like I was sharing my home with more than just my husband. I felt a growing sense of unease creeping into my own space. I tried to broach the subject with Jake a few times, but the conversation never really went anywhere. He'd look conflicted, torn between his parents and me. "I know it's a lot, Rosie," he'd say, his expression genuinely pained. "But they're my parents. What am I supposed to do?" I'd nod, trying my best to be patient and understanding, but inside I was starting to feel resentful. "I understand, Jake," I'd reply, forcing a smile, "but we need our own space, our own life. This feels crowded." My words felt hollow, like I wasn't getting through. Then came the evening I walked into the living room to find Susan rearranging the furniture. That's when I knew something had to change. This wasn't just about their belongings anymore. They were starting to take over my life. A knot formed in my stomach, and a wave of frustration washed over me. This was supposed to be our home. I remember the frustration bubbling up inside me when Susan shoved the sofa across the room. "I thought this would look better over here," she declared. A wave of irritation washed over me. "Susan," I managed, trying to keep my voice even, "I really appreciate the help, but I actually preferred it where it was." Her surprised expression made me feel a pang of guilt, but I really didn't want the sofa moved. "Oh," she said, a little deflated. "I just thought it needed a refresh. But okay, I'll put it back." I watched her reluctantly drag it back to its original spot, and the guilt intensified. I shouldn't have snapped at her. I know she was only trying to help. One evening I came home completely drained after a long day at work, craving quiet and solitude. Instead, I walked into what felt like a stranger's living room. There were people everywhere, chatting and laughing. Robert and Susan had thrown a party. Without even mentioning it to me, Susan rushed over, a glass of wine in hand. "Rosie, dear, we thought we'd have a little get-together. Hope you don't mind," she chirped. My eyes scanned the unfamiliar faces, my exhaustion morphing into a simmering resentment. I just wanted to sink into the sofa and be alone, but my living room had been transformed into a party I hadn't planned and didn't want. The weight of it all pressed down on me, and I struggled to maintain a semblance of composure. It felt like my personal space, my sanctuary, had been invaded. I remember the tightness in my chest when I told Susan, "Actually, I do mind." Jake and I had plans tonight. The room fell silent, and I could see the disappointment on her face. It made me feel awful, a pang of guilt washing over me, even though I knew I had nothing to be guilty about. "Oh," she said quietly, her voice trailing off. "I didn't realise. We'll wrap this up then." Jake stepped in, thankfully, smoothing things over. "Yeah, Mum, we had a quiet evening planned. Maybe check with us next time." They didn't linger much longer after that, but the awkwardness remained, hanging heavy in the air, even after they left. I felt a strange sense of displacement in my own home, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. It was clear that something needed to shift, that we needed to redraw some lines. Later I talked to Jake again, the feeling of unease still lingering. "This can't keep happening, Jake," I said, trying to keep my voice level, trying to express the growing frustration without sounding accusatory. "We really need to set some boundaries with your parents." This time his response felt different. He nodded, his expression serious. "You're right," he said, and I could sense a new resolve in his voice. "You're right, Rosie." It gave me a sliver of hope, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, things would start to change. I needed to feel like we were a team, that we were building our own space together, and that required a little more consideration from his family. It wasn't about shutting them out, not at all. It was about finding a balance, about respecting our time and our need for privacy. It was about making our home truly feel like our home. I knew I had to address the situation. This house is our home, my home with Jake, and I deserved to feel comfortable and relaxed within its walls. It was time to establish some boundaries. The pressure finally reached a boiling point when Jake and I were planning a much-needed getaway. We both felt drained and desperately needed a break from everything, especially the constant presence of his parents. I was so excited for just the two of us to have some uninterrupted time together. "Just imagine, a whole week, just us," I told Jake as we packed. I could feel the anticipation bubbling inside me. He smiled and hugged me, echoing my sentiments. "We absolutely need this, Rosie." We told Robert and Susan about our plans over dinner, assuming they'd be happy for us. "We're heading off for a week-long vacation. Just wanted to give you a heads up," Jake announced. Susan's surprised expression caught me off guard. "A whole week?" she questioned. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. This wasn't going to be easy. I braced myself for what I knew might be a difficult conversation. I hoped they would understand. I really did. This trip meant a lot to me. A chance to reconnect with Jake and rediscover the peace and quiet we so desperately craved in our own home. I remember worrying about the house. What about it? Who's going to look after it? I glanced at Jake. He reassured me, "It'll be fine, Susan. It's just a week." So we left for our holiday. Those first few days were heavenly. No interruptions, no surprises, just pure relaxation. It felt so good to finally unwind. That feeling didn't last, though. On the third day, Jake's work called. Some kind of emergency. They needed him back immediately. Our peaceful escape was over. I was so disappointed, our time together cut so short. Of course, I understood these things happen, but it didn't make it any easier. We arrived home 2 days early, expecting to find the house just as we'd left it. But walking through the door, I realized something was very, very wrong. Music and laughter spilled out as I pushed open the door. My heart skipped a beat. Our living room was full of strangers. A wave of confusion washed over me. "What the—" I heard beside me and knew Jake was just as bewildered. We stepped inside, the noise and the crowd pressing in. Then I saw them, Mom and Dad, right in the middle of it all, like they were hosting some kind of impromptu party. It felt surreal. My brother's voice, sharp with surprise and something else, cut through the chatter. "Mom! Dad! What is happening here?" I watched Mom's face. Her smile faltered, disappearing as her eyes met ours. "Jake! Rosie! You weren't supposed to be back yet!" she exclaimed. All I could manage, trying to sound calmer than I felt, was a simple question. "Who are all these people?" Dad cleared his throat, the sound uncomfortably loud in the sudden hush that had fallen over the room. I could feel the tension crackling in the air, a strange mix of anticipation and unease settling over me. What on earth was going on? "Well, we thought since you were away we'd rent the place out to some friends, just for a few days." I felt my jaw drop. "You did what?" Jake looked like he was about to explode. "You rented out our house without even asking us." Susan wrung her hands. "We thought it would be fine. You were away and these friends needed a place to stay." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They had turned our home into a rental property without our permission. The nerve of it all left me speechless. Jake was fuming, everyone out. "Now," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. The strangers gathered their things, murmuring apologies as they left. Robert and Susan stood there, looking guilty but also defiant. I watched the argument unfold, a knot tightening in my stomach. Robert's weak justifications just fueled the fire, making Jake's voice shake even more. I felt a wave of anger wash over me, but underneath it was a deep, sinking disappointment. This was supposed to be our home, a safe space, not a source of constant stress. Standing there, listening to them go back and forth, I realized I couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't just a one-time thing. It was a pattern, and I was tired of it. Something had to give. This couldn't continue. Later, after Robert and Susan had left, the silence in the house was heavy. We sat down at the kitchen table, the remnants of the earlier chaos still lingering in the air. Jake tried to address his parents calmly, but I could see the frustration simmering beneath the surface. I didn't say much, but my silence was a statement in itself. Seeing Susan cry added another layer of complexity to the situation, but I couldn't let that sway my resolve. This was our home, our marriage, and it was time to protect it. This intrusion, this disregard for our boundaries, couldn't happen again. I knew I needed to make that clear for both our sakes. We needed to establish some boundaries, some ground rules, and I was ready to do whatever it took to make sure they were respected. We didn't mean any harm. We just thought, "No, Mum, there's no excuse for this," Jake interrupted. "We need our privacy. We need you to respect our home." They apologized, promising it would never happen again. But their apologies felt empty, and their promises even more so. I looked at Jake, and I could tell he felt the same way, exhausted and at my wits' end. I knew we had to do something. The love I felt for Jake propelled me to find a middle ground, a solution that wouldn't tear our family apart. The constant invasions by his parents were suffocating, and it was time to reclaim our space. "We need a break, Jake, and we need to do something about your parents," I said, the determination clear in my voice. Understanding the gravity of the situation, Jake nodded. "You're right. I felt we desperately needed a weekend away, a true escape. But there was something I needed to do first, something that felt crucial for my peace of mind. I insisted we change the locks. I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability, the intrusion of having them just walk in whenever they pleased. It felt like reclaiming my space, establishing a boundary that should have been there from the start. The simple act of turning the key in the new lock brought a surprising sense of relief, a small victory. With the new lock securely in place, I began packing my bag, anticipation bubbling inside me. I had a strong urge to completely disconnect, to be truly present during our getaway. I suggested to Jake that we turn off our phones for the entire weekend. No distractions, no outside world intruding on our time together. He readily agreed. Leaving the house with our phones powered off felt strangely liberating, like shedding an invisible weight. I felt a lightness and hope for the quiet days ahead. The weekend itself was blissful. We spent hours talking, laughing, and rediscovering each other. For a brief period, the anxieties and pressures of everyday life faded into the background. It was a precious bubble of peace and tranquility. But as our time away drew to a close, a knot of apprehension began to tighten in my stomach. I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was waiting for us back home. The drive back felt heavy, the silence in the car amplifying my growing unease. As soon as we turned our phones back on, the ringing confirmed my fears. My phone rang, displaying an unfamiliar number. A nervous "Hello!" escaped my lips. "This is Officer Daniels. Am I speaking with Mrs. Rosie Thompson?" A serious voice on the other end asked. "Yes, this is she," I managed, my heart already pounding in my chest. A wave of anxiety washed over me as the officer continued. "I'm calling about an incident at your residence. We've apprehended several individuals who forced entry into your home." My mouth suddenly felt like cotton. "Broke the locks, entered our home," I stammered, trying to process the words. "Yes, ma'am," the officer confirmed. "It seems they were attempting unauthorized access. We have them in custody at the station." I felt a chill run down my spine. The world seemed to tilt a little. My mind raced, trying to comprehend what I'd just heard. The violation of our private space, the sheer audacity of it, left me shaken. What were they looking for? What would have happened if we'd been home? The questions whirled around in my head, creating a dizzying sense of unease. I could feel the beginnings of a tremor in my hands. I needed a moment to collect myself before I could even think about what to do next. The officer's words, forced entry, unauthorized access, apprehended individuals, echoed in my ears, each repetition amplifying the feeling of vulnerability. It felt so surreal, like something out of a bad dream. "We'll be home soon, officer." "Thank you for letting us know," I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady. Hanging up, I relayed the information to Jake. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, and he let out a long, deep breath. Who would do that? And why? I whispered, a sense of dread washing over me. "We'll find out soon enough," Jake replied, his jaw set firmly. As Jake and I drove home, the weight of uncertainty was heavy in the car. We both knew that whatever awaited us at home was bound to be unpleasant. The thought of strangers breaking into our home was unsettling, but deep down I had a nagging suspicion about who might be involved. "We should have seen this coming," Jake said, breaking the silence. Changing the locks was bound to set them off. I nodded, knowing he was referring to his parents. I remember thinking, we just have to handle this and get past it. We can't let this destroy everything we've worked for, but pulling up to the house and seeing the police car parked out front, a chilling wave washed over me. This wasn't some bad dream. It was actually happening. My stomach dropped. Officer Daniels, a tall, imposing figure, met us at the door. His expression was serious. He told us they'd caught someone trying to break in, and that they were quite persistent. I could feel the tension radiating off of Jake, though I didn't need to hear his question to know what he was thinking. The officer confirmed our unspoken fears. It was Jake's parents, along with some of their friends. I watched Jake's face drain of colour. He seemed utterly bewildered, muttering, "My parents? Why would they?" The officer explained that they apparently hadn't been told about the locks being changed. I felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. Disbelief, anxiety, and a growing sense of unease. What were we supposed to do now? This whole situation felt surreal, like some kind of twisted family drama unfolding before my eyes. I was worried about Jake, about us, and about what this meant for our future. It felt like the ground had shifted beneath our feet, and I wasn't sure what to hold on to. The officer's words hung in the air. When they couldn't get in, they tried to force their way. My mind raced. I felt a wave of disbelief wash over me. Mom and Dad had actually tried to force their way in. It felt surreal. This wasn't them. This was some bizarre, alternate reality. "Can we see them?" I managed to ask, my throat tight. The officer confirmed they were still at the station and we could talk to them. I glanced at Jake. We didn't need words. We both knew we had to go. We had to face this, whatever this was. The drive to the station felt like an eternity. My stomach churned with a mixture of anxiety and dread. What would I say? What could I say? At the station, we were led to a small, sterile room. Mom and Dad sat hunched over, a palpable tension radiating from them. They looked a mixture of furious and ashamed. I noticed some of their friends were there too, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Seeing them just amplified the awkwardness and surreal nature of the situation. The air was thick with unspoken words and regret. Jake broke the silence, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Mum! Dad! What were you thinking?" My own thoughts echoed his. What had possessed them to do something so reckless? I just couldn't comprehend it. I felt a knot in my stomach as my father-in-law, Robert, rose to his feet, his face tight with anger. "We came to check on the house," he declared. "We've always had a key. Why were the locks changed without our knowledge?" His words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. My husband, Jake, tried to diffuse the situation, his voice strained but even. "Dad, it's our house now. You can't just come and go whenever you want. We've discussed this before." I could see the tension in his shoulders, the effort it took him to remain composed. My mother-in-law, Susan, began to cry. Her tears pricked at my own conscience, but I held firm. I had to. This had been going on for too long. Finally, I found my voice, though it trembled slightly. "This isn't about trying to keep you out," I explained, trying to keep my tone level and calm. "It's about boundaries. It's about our privacy. You can't just walk into our home whenever you feel like it. It simply isn't right." The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. I could feel the weight of their friends' gazes, silent observers to this painful family drama. I was sure they were regretting their involvement in this awkward, unwelcome visit. I knew I was. I just wanted it to be over. I remember one of them mumbling an apology, saying they didn't know what else to do. Then Officer Daniels stepped in, his voice firm. "We understand this is a family matter," he said, "but breaking and entering is a serious offence. We need assurances this won't happen again." I can still picture Jake looking at my parents, his expression a mixture of sadness and something like steely determination. "This can't happen again, Mom and Dad," he told them. "You have to understand boundaries." I saw the realization dawn on their faces, a sobering moment for all of us. Leaving the police station, my heart felt like lead. The drive home was shrouded in silence. I was lost in my own thoughts, replaying the events of the day over and over in my mind. A heavy weight settled over me as we walked back into the house. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that things would never be quite the same again. The days that followed were a blur, like trying to navigate through a dense fog. I struggled to process everything, to reconcile the image of my parents I'd always held with the reality of their actions. The aftermath was almost as difficult as the incident itself. Jake and I had to endure countless awkward conversations with our neighbours, trying to explain the unexplainable. It felt like an invasion of privacy, having to share such a deeply personal and painful experience with people who were, at best, casual acquaintances. Every explanation felt inadequate, like a flimsy bandage over a deep wound. I just wanted to retreat, to shut the world out and somehow find a way to piece our lives back together. The weight of it all was exhausting, a constant pressure in my chest. I kept wondering how we would ever truly move past this, how we could ever regain a sense of normalcy. I felt so drained. The whole situation was just mortifying. One evening, Jake and I were in the living room, and he sighed, this heavy, weary sigh. I remember him saying something about his parents, how he never expected things to escalate like this. I took his hand, trying to offer some comfort, some reassurance. We sat there quietly for a long time, holding hands. My mind was racing, a whirlwind of anxieties and uncertainties. I couldn't shake this heavy feeling in my chest. The sudden ring of the doorbell startled me. It was Mrs. Henderson, our neighbour. I could see the concern etched on her face. She asked if everything was all right, mentioning that she'd seen police cars the other day. I just told her it was a family matter and that things were under control now. I didn't want to go into details. It felt too personal to share. I tried to sound confident, but honestly, I wasn't sure what under control even meant at that point. The interaction left me feeling even more exposed and vulnerable. Closing the door, I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. I just wanted this whole ordeal to be over. "Thank you for checking in," I said, giving her a small, reassuring smile. I could tell she still felt unsure, but I hoped my smile helped a little. "Seriously, if there's anything at all I can do, just let me know." She finally left, and I turned my attention to getting things back to normal. I felt a strong need to reconnect with the community, to rebuild the sense of normalcy. The thought of a small gathering popped into my head. It felt right. "I think we should have a few people over," I suggested to Jake. "Just a casual get-together with some of the neighbours." "Maybe this weekend?" He agreed readily, and we started planning. The preparations themselves were a welcome distraction. Focusing on food, drinks, and setting up the backyard gave my mind something positive to latch onto. It felt good to be doing something productive, something that felt normal. We kept the guest list short, just a handful of our closest neighbours. I wanted it to feel intimate and relaxed. As the day arrived, I found myself getting more and more excited. One by one, our neighbours started to arrive, filling our backyard with laughter and conversation. The atmosphere was light and easy, exactly what I'd hoped for. It was such a relief to connect with people, to share a laugh, and to feel a sense of community again. For the first time in a while, I felt like things were finally starting to feel okay. The evening unfolded pleasantly, each conversation a small step towards healing and reconnecting. I realised how much I'd missed these simple moments of connection, the gentle hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the shared laughter. It all felt so reassuring, so comforting. This was exactly what I needed. Mrs. Henderson came up to me, her voice warm. "You two make such a lovely couple," she said, her gaze softening. "It's such a pity about the difficulties with your in-laws." I offered what I hoped was a reassuring smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. We're doing our best to navigate it all." As the evening finally drew to a close, a wave of exhaustion, but also a sense of quiet accomplishment, washed over me. The gathering had done its job. A palpable shift in the atmosphere had settled over the neighbourhood. It felt like the beginning of a thaw. These past few weeks have been utterly draining, a constant emotional tightrope walk. But tonight I feel a renewed sense of determination. Jake and I are on the same page. We both know what needs to happen. We have to establish some clear boundaries. It feels daunting, but necessary. Sitting at our kitchen table, pen in hand, I carefully begin to list out the boundaries, the rules we need to establish, not just for the sake of our relationship, but for my own well-being. "This can't continue, Jake," I said, my voice firm despite the tremor of anxiety I felt. "We need to change things." "It's time to take control," he nodded, his face clouded. "I know," he murmured. It's going to be difficult." I knew he was right. My stomach twisted with a knot of anxiety. Later, after we'd talked it through some more and felt a little more prepared, we asked Jake's parents to come over. I felt a wave of apprehension wash over me as they settled onto the sofa in our living room. The air was thick with unspoken tension. I could hear the nervous tremor in Jake's voice, even though he tried to sound so strong. "Mom, Dad," he began, his hands clenching and unclenching in his lap. "We need to talk about a few things, some changes we're making around here." Their faces, a mixture of bewilderment and worry, were turned towards us, searching for answers. Taking a shaky breath, I jumped in. "We've decided we need to set some boundaries about your visits," I said, forcing my voice to stay level and even, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. My heart pounded against my ribs. Robert, Jake's father, arched an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Boundaries?" he questioned, his voice laced with a hint of skepticism. I saw Jake inhale deeply, steeling himself. "Yes," he said firmly. "For instance, we need you to call before coming over. No more surprise visits." I held my breath, waiting for their reaction, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. I tried to soften the blow as much as possible, but telling them felt like ripping off a bandage. "We can't give you the keys back," I explained, my voice as gentle as I could manage. "It's really important for us to have our own space, our own privacy." I could see Susan's face fall instantly. It felt awful. Seeing her so upset really tugged at my heartstrings. She looked so hurt and confused, asking, "But we're family. Why are you doing this to us?" I struggled to find the right words, the ones that would somehow bridge the gap between our needs and their expectations. "It's not about pushing you away, Susan. It's about respect and having the privacy we need to nurture our own relationship. We love you both very much, but healthy boundaries are important for everyone involved." I wasn't prepared for the intensity of their reaction. Tears welled up in Susan's eyes and started streaming down her cheeks. I felt a wave of guilt wash over me, even though I knew we were doing the right thing. The situation felt so raw and exposed. Then Robert's face turned a deep crimson, and his voice rose with anger. Hearing him say things like, "This is outrageous. We're your parents. How could you treat us like strangers?" just made the whole situation feel so much worse. I could feel the tension radiating off him, and it made my stomach clench. The whole situation was spiraling. I could hear Jake's voice, strained and tight, trying to de-escalate things. "We're not trying to hurt you," he said. "We just need some ground rules, some structure." It was heartbreaking to see everyone so distraught, especially Susan, whose sobs just seemed to escalate. I wished there was a way to make everyone understand, to bridge this divide without causing so much pain. I felt a wave of frustration wash over me. We refuse to accept these rules. The words tumbled out, sharp and desperate. It felt like they were pushing us away, erecting walls between us. The conversation quickly deteriorated. I tried to explain our perspective, our reasons, but it was like talking to a brick wall. They just wouldn't listen, retreating further into their hurt and accusations. Their tears and pronouncements of victimhood made me feel helpless and incredibly frustrated. I could see the same defeat mirrored in Jake's eyes. We exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of the impasse we had reached. Then Jake's voice, thick with sadness, broke the tense silence. "Maybe some time apart would be best." I nodded, my chest tightening with a mixture of sadness and relief. Watching them leave, their tears a stark reminder of the rift between us, was agonizing. The silence that descended upon the house after the door closed felt heavy and oppressive. Making that decision, asking for space, was one of the most difficult things I've ever had to do. But deep down, I knew it was necessary. We needed breathing room to process everything, and they needed time to hopefully understand and respect the boundaries we were trying to establish. In the quiet aftermath, Jake's arms wrapped around me, a comforting weight against the hollowness in my chest. "I'm so sorry it had to come to this," he murmured. I leaned into him, seeking solace in his embrace, the silence of our home now a stark contrast to the emotional storm that had just passed. I was heartbroken, but I clung to a sliver of hope that this separation, this painful pause, would eventually lead to a stronger, healthier relationship. I keep telling myself it's okay, that we did what we had to do, that standing up for ourselves was the only option left. But even as I repeat these words, a wave of sadness washes over me. It's a heavy feeling, this mixture of guilt and a quiet ache in my chest. I replay the whole thing in my head, over and over, second-guessing every word, every decision. It's hard, so hard, to reconcile the need for self-preservation with the longing for connection. Still, beneath the surface of my doubt, a flicker of conviction remains. I know, deep down, that setting boundaries was necessary. It was a last resort, a painful but essential step to protect ourselves. It feels strange, this new distance. Robert and Susan are currently out of my life. It feels surreal to even type those words. This silence stretches between us, a chasm filled with unspoken words and hurt feelings. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if they will ever understand why I did what I did. Maybe they'll judge me. Maybe they won't. Right now, I just need time. Time to process, time to heal, time to simply breathe. I have to hope that someday, somehow things will feel different, that this heavy feeling in my chest will eventually lift. For now, I'm focusing on taking care of myself, on finding peace in the quiet space I've created.